Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the third entry in the France country series. This time we're taking a huge jump in time and we're going to the 1500s for the French Wars of Religion from History Matters. This was back when he used to do only the 10-minute history. And fun fact, this was actually his last 10-minute history video that he did. And he changed formats into the smaller ones and then his channel blew up. So it seems like it was a good idea. This is a topic that I don't really know too much about. Again, 15th century, 14th, etc. history is not really as much my forte, as I've said a few times before, but I thought this would be interesting, and obviously this is very, very important for France, the Protestant-Catholic divide that will be better explained here by History Matters. Other than that, don't really have much else to say. If you haven't already yet, please remember to comment, like, subscribe. Without further ado, let's get into it.
1534, and the King of France is a bit angry. The King, Francis I of the House of Valois, was unhappy because overnight posters had sprung up across France denouncing Catholicism and its practices as evil. The King, who was a devout Catholic, was horrified, mostly because he'd been quite tolerant of the nascent Protestant movement up until now, and also because one of said posters had been stuck to his bedroom door.
How'd it get there?
Francis could no longer tolerate Protestantism, and so he rounded up those responsible and also some who weren't responsible and burned them at the stake. The persecutions led to many Protestants, the most notable being John Calvin fleeing to Switzerland. His religious persecution...
What's so interesting too is that how much of European history, religious persecution is one of the main reasons for conflict, right? You have, for example, the French, I mean, obviously what we're watching right here, the French Wars of Religion, which last for 3 decades plus, right, as well as all the Protestant-Catholic divides. You have everything that's going on in the UK with that, and then it's just such a mess of Protestant versus Catholicism, which to this day, it's kind of something that I don't think we really often think about, of how much that divide has really just been stamped out, for lack of a better word, that there isn't that huge, you know, bloody, violent Catholic-Protestant divide that there was for hundreds of years in European history. And while that might seem kind of obvious, it's just such a fascinating thing to think of as we sort of done these, you know, gone more back in the past, not 20th century history, but before then, just how much blood has been spilled on European soil over religion. Maybe it's the concept that the most blood in the world has ever been spilled over. I don't know.
Persecutions continued throughout the rest of his reign, which would end in 1547. Due to death. He was succeeded by his son, Henry II, who continued the persecution of Protestants. He created a new court for the prosecution of heresy called the Burning Chamber. Henry wasn't exactly a good friend to the popes either, though. He boycotted the Council of Trent, the Church's first attempt at creating a united response to the rise of Protestantism, and he also stopped giving the Pope money. There were 2 reasons for this. The first was that Henry wanted the response to Protestantism in France to be a French one, and second, the neighbouring Holy Roman Empire also had issues with Protestants, and Henry didn't want to help the Habsburgs. Why? Because war. Henry had continued his father's wars against the Habsburgs, which came to an end in 1559. It was fairly inconclusive, and to celebrate peace, Henry decided to hold a jousting tournament. He opted to take part in the jousting himself and swiftly got a lance to the eye. He would soon succumb to his wounds and the throne passed to his young son, who was crowned Francis II. Francis was only 14 at this point, and whilst technically old enough to govern, the actual running of the realm fell to the uncles of his wife, Mary Stuart, better known as Mary Queen of Scots. The 2 men running the kingdom were Francis, the Duke of Guise, and Charles, the Cardinal of Lorraine. They were both from the powerful Guise family and were ardent Catholics, meaning that for the Protestants, Bernie time would continue. The 2 Guises didn't simply dominate the king without any resistance. Francis II's mother and the former Queen, Catherine de' Medici, vied for power too. So the Protestants, also known as the...
Interesting. So I didn't know that Catherine the Great was during this point as well. Yeah. Also a really, really interesting figure. That was another video that I was thinking about doing one on, is doing one on Catherine the Great. But again, it's difficult to try and get so much information on such an important person in French history into a single video. And hey, who knows? Maybe we'll pop one in here before we get to the more modern stuff. But yeah, maybe I'll do that at a different point too. Let me know what you think below.
The Huguenots felt that the king wasn't really anti-Protestant and that if they simply liberated him, things would get better. This culminated in the 1560 conspiracy of Amboise, an attempt to kidnap the king from his residence. The conspiracy was betrayed, most of the plotters were captured and killed, and to many it's confirmed that the Huguenots were the enemy of France. One of the leaders of the plot was a man called Louis, the Prince of Conde. Conde was arrested, but the situation would become much more complicated when Francis II died in late 1560. Francis had no children, and so he was succeeded by his 10-year-old brother, Charles IX. Another
nice.
young king on the throne meant that, yet again, factions vied for power over him. It was Catherine who won out in the end, becoming his regent and swiftly removing the Guises from court. She took a different approach to the religious divisions in France and opted for a policy of toleration. She released Conde in 1561, and in 1562 Catherine issued the Edict of Saint-Germain, which gave the Huguenots the right to worship so long as it was outside of cities and so long as they stayed loyal to the king. For many...
Interesting. So I wonder how many European countries at this point actually do have the idea of freedom of worship, right? I know that, for example, I think in Austria this was not something that was allowed, but I might be wrong on that. But that would be kind of a cool video in and of itself to see the sort of time periods when freedom of religion was established and how, I don't know, for example, maybe that was better for the economy. All sorts of things like this. I would argue that, you know, religious toleration is one of the what would you say? One of the founding principles of freedom that we have now in a lot of modern societies. But I'm interested in sort of a past look and see if there's any sort of correlation between economic growth or, you know, some sort of other prosperity principle that could be correlated with religious freedom. I don't know. Kind of an interesting idea, though. I didn't know that it was Catherine the Great, though, that did this. Cool.
Catholic nobles, though, this was a step too far. One such noble was the Duke of Guise, who promptly massacred a group of worshipping Huguenots at the town of Vassy. Both sides took up arms after this, and France descended into violence, and so began the First French War of Religion. Alongside the Prince of Conde, the Huguenots were led by Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. The Huguenots seized major cities like Orléans, Lyon and Tours, and within a few months these lands were theirs. The Catholic forces counterattacked, the Prince of Conde was captured again in late 1562, and the next year the Duke of Guise was killed by an assassin while sieging Orléans. Neither side could really defeat the other, and so in 1563 the Edict of Amboise was signed, which gave Huguenots a few more rights. So much as recognising that Huguenots were allowed to exist was too much for many of the Catholics who resisted the enforcement of the peace. As such, Catherine and Charles went on a royal tour of France to assert the king's independence and force the lords to implement the Edict of Amboise. By this point, Protestant rebellion had spread to the Spanish Netherlands, and so the King of Spain, Philippe II, sent an army to crush them. This worried the Huguenots, who wondered if the Spanish army was actually meant for them. After another failed attempt to kidnap the king by the Prince of Conde in 1567, both sides took up arms, and suddenly, Second French War of Religion. This war was a stalemate, and in 1568 another peace was signed. The Cardinal of Lorraine strictly opposed any peace, and he and his allies in court overturned it. The next year, Catholics took up arms, and Third French War of Religion. The Third Religious War was much bloodier than the first two, mostly because of foreign support for both sides, but yet again no side could defeat the other. It did see the death of Conde, though, leaving Coligny in charge of the Huguenots. Peace was made in 1570 and the Huguenots were given near equality legally, but the problem remained: the Catholic population of France didn't want the Protestants there. The Huguenots were also now given formal control over several important cities, the most notable being La Rochelle. Coligny soon after became a trusted advisor to King Charles, and thus Catherine was sidelined. Charles also opted to have his sister married to the Protestant King Henry of Navarre. Navarre, in case you were wondering, is here. All of the most prominent Huguenots went to Paris to attend the wedding on August the 18th in 1572. 4 days after the ceremony, Coligny was shot but survived. Tensions exploded in the city, and 2 days later, on August the 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, many Protestant leaders, including Coligny himself, were murdered. This was followed by the people of Paris taking to the streets and murdering any Huguenots they could find. Over many weeks, violence spread throughout France, and many thousands of Huguenots were killed in what is known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Henry of Navarre was spared, though, when he promised to convert to Catholicism. The massacre severely weakened the Huguenot side by depriving them of decent leadership, but still, War No. 4 broke out. It ended the same way: nobody could win, and in 1573 they made peace. The next year another war broke out, because at this point, why not? During this war, Charles IX died, and Catherine took up the regency until her third son, who had just been elected the King of Poland and Lithuania, could return to take the throne. He got back in 1575 and was crowned King Henry III. His reign got off to a great start when he...
The French are really not terribly original with these king names, are they? It's either Charles, Louis, or Henry. Always have the same name.
His younger brother and heir, Francis, rebelled against him and made an alliance with the Huguenots. Henry of Navarre soon escaped the royal court and promptly unconverted from Catholicism, and was soon leading the Huguenot rebels. No one could defeat the...
See, this is the interesting thing, is like, it just seems like I understand, you know, me as an individual, I was not raised in a very religious household, and so I don't really understand what the true divide here is, but it just seems so wasteful that you can just as simply unconvert or reconvert to Catholicism or Protestantism or whatever. Like, it just seems so wasteful. Like, it just seems like such a waste of life. I mean, I'm sure that there's maybe some more detailed rationale as to why these two completely opposed each other other than ideological basis. But if it really is that simple, then I don't know. It's just sort of sad in a way, I guess. I don't know. I'm curious what you guys think, though. Let me know.
The other piece again, you know the drill. Like every other peace, the king couldn't enforce it, and furthermore, the Huguenots refused to disarm, since the last time they had done so, they were massacred. Henry thus decided that he would try crushing the Protestants, and so began the Sixth War. It will shock you to find out that no one could win this war, and another peace treaty was signed, which basically allowed Protestants freedom of worship everywhere except for Paris. There was a brief Seventh War from 1579 to 1580, and yet again, the same thing happened. The king and his younger brother had repaired their damaged relationship, and Francis did two things. One, he got engaged to Queen Elizabeth I of England, although she was likely just using him as a pawn, and two, he went to the United Provinces here to help them fight the Spanish forces and become their king. He was completely useless at this. He didn't get married because Elizabeth was too smart for that, and he returned from the Netherlands in shame in 1583. Fortunately for Francis, though, he wouldn't have to live with the shame for too long, since he died in 1584. This was a big deal because Francis had been the heir to the throne. Since Henry III didn't have any children, that left another man as his heir, King Henry of Navarre, the Protestant one. If you thought the Catholic nobility in France were worried before, well, now they were downright hysterical. In response to this crisis, the Duke of Guise, the son of the previous one, formed the Catholic League to stop Henry of Navarre from ever taking the throne. It was comprised of some of the most devout Catholic nobles across France and was backed, that is, financed by King Philippe II of Spain, who was also pretty scared of the idea of a Protestant France. King Henry was bankrupt and he couldn't really resist the League, and so to placate them, he issued the Edict of Namur in 1585. This essentially made being a Huguenot illegal and gave them 6 months to convert or leave France. The Duke of Guise and the League were expelling Huguenots from the north, but also were telling French subjects that Henry wasn't a true Catholic since he refused to bar a Protestant from the succession and to accept their appointed heir, Cardinal Charles de Bourbon, Henry of Navarre's uncle. In 1587, France yet again erupted into its 8th war of religion, but it's better known by another name, the War of the Three Henrys. A German army invaded the north to aid the Protestants, but was defeated by the Duke of Guise, who became incredibly popular as a result. He demanded a bunch of land and titles as thanks for his victory. The king...
Actually, yeah, wait, where did the Germans fall into this specifically? So obviously Germany is not formed or anything, obviously, but the Holy Roman Empire, are there some states that are, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are some states that are Protestant, the ones that are more to the north, and then in the south it's more Catholic, which I think is still reflected in modern Germany today. So for example, Bayern is way more Catholic than in the north in, say, Hamburg. And then in the east, I think, is the least religious place in all of Europe, if I remember that correctly. Though that has nothing to do with this time period. But how is this all affecting these other players as well as, you know, Spain, England, Austria, for example? I'm kind of interested in that as well. As like, who was the... Denmark, actually. Denmark, I think, was Protestant at this point, too. So who was sort of seen as the protectorate of Protestantism? Would that have been England? Would that have been another nation? I don't know. This is just a topic that I'm not that familiar with, but this is cool, though. This is a good sort of like stepping stone into wars of religion in Europe, I suppose.
He said no, and also barred Guise from Paris. Guise entered anyway, and the people of Paris rose up in defiance with him in what's known as the Day of the Barricades, and the king fled the city. In 1588, the king called the Estates General, the Grand Parliament of France, to meet in Blois. Whilst there, he had Guise assassinated and arrested some high-ranking members of the League. And as such, the League was now at war with the king. Thus, King Henry and the other King Henry made a truce. They combined their forces and marched on Paris in 1589. Henry III was close to taking the city until he was assassinated by a monk, and with him died the royal house of Valois. According to French royal inheritance law called Salic law, Henry of Navarre was now king, and the first Protestant king of France. Henry pressed his claim to the throne and marched on Paris. He laid siege to the capital, but then Philippe II sent an army into France which broke the siege. Fighting continued for the next couple of years, but Henry IV won out in the end for two reasons.
What would this fighting have looked like? Was this actually taking place in Paris? Was this taking place outside of Paris? What did this sort of, because I can picture, you know, urban fighting and things like this, but obviously that wasn't how wars were fought back then. So 5 years though, wow, this must have just bankrupted these countries.
1. The Cardinal of Bourbon died and the League couldn't decide on another successor, and 2. Henry converted to Catholicism in 1593. The next year, Henry was crowned King Henry IV of France, the first of the royal house of Bourbon. Resistance to Henry's rule continued, but was largely crushed within a year. The fact that the Spanish crown was largely responsible for this resistance led to Henry declaring war on it. The war came to an end in 1598, but not until Henry had issued the Edict of Nantes, which gave recognition and near equal rights to Protestants across France, providing they remain loyal to the crown. The edict was was a series of wins.
But that was the same thing that Catherine did. So, you know what I mean? It was all kind of for nothing.
And losses for the Protestants and the Catholics. Whilst no side was truly happy with it, the level of resistance to it was much lower than before, because at this point everyone was sick of war. Huguenots couldn't prevent Catholics from worshipping in their strongholds like La Rochelle and had to pay taxes to the Catholic Church. However, they were allowed to remain armed and they could hold their own councils. These ultimately weakened Henry's authority across his kingdom, but Nantes did something that the other edicts didn't. It built a lasting peace. That is, until Louis XIV realised that he didn't need to keep that peace anymore. Whilst this didn't put a stop to the religious tensions in France, it did end its most violent period, which saw millions of Frenchmen die. The French wars of religion were finally over, and France, unlike so many others, would remain a Catholic nation hereafter. I hope you enjoyed.
Fascinating. Wow. So much blood spilled in the name of religion. Let me know what you thought in the comment section below. Maybe you can fill in a few gaps there. Maybe you can just simply tell me, why do these two factions really hate each other? I mean, I don't know. Anyways, that's all from me. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you appreciate this quick video here on your Friday night. All the best. Take care, and I'll see you guys in the next video.